Welcome to the Apple II Pi 2021. This is an update to the Apple II Pi project. That's been a long time coming, and it's actually the most exciting version yet. I want to show you how it comes together and what it can do. And we're going to start off by using this very basic Apple IIe Platinum. And it is the most minimal Apple IIe you can pretty much buy. Nothing in the slots, only 64K, so it's very minimal. It does have a CH joystick attached to it, and we'll get to that in just a moment. But let's see what we have today. This is the new version of the Apple II Pi card. What really makes this different than the previous versions is Ultimate Apple II commissioned a custom chip right here. A design that incorporates the functionality of the 6551 serial chip, as well as controls access to a ROM that now sits on the card. And this card is actually able to boot directly into the Apple II Pi client software on the Apple II, and your Raspberry Pi card right here, and this is a Raspberry Pi 2, will plug into this card. Now it's all designed for the 40-pin header. Ensure that you have all the pins lined up. Clips in. You can actually screw the card down for a really solid fit, but it's a very nice looking card now. It designed for the B models of the Raspberry Pi. One thing to note, it is not compatible with the Raspberry Pi 4. The Raspberry Pi 4 is just too power hungry for our Apple II bus to provide power. The Apple really wasn't designed for such power hungry devices. However, the Raspberry Pi 1, the Raspberry Pi 2, as in this case, and if you have an upgraded power supply, you can probably get away with the Raspberry Pi 3. But I think the Raspberry Pi 2 is really the sweet spot in terms of power draw and performance. It has a 4-core processor, 1 gig of memory, and is able to run the Raspberry Pi OS desktop adequately. And that's not a full-blown modern desktop computer, but it allows you to run things like web browsers with a little bit of patience. But let's see how we connect this thing up. At the bottom now, we have our ports coming off of the Raspberry Pi, and here we have our HDMI cable with a 90-degree bend in it that will plug right into here. Now you notice it kind of has to come off pointing to the right, and that's just the reality of getting all this to fit on a card that will plug into the Apple II. Also, if you want, you can plug in your networking cable, and we can plug this into any slot we want now. All of them are open, but in this case, I am going to select slot 2, just on a whim. Plug that in, and I'm going to put my case on here, my lid, so that I can move the monitor. Now this is a kind of a cheap little modern LCD TV, but it has the benefit of a composite in port coming directly from the Apple II, as well as an HDMI port, which is coming directly from the Raspberry Pi card. There are no other devices in this Apple II, so it is booting from the Raspberry Pi card now. If we change our input to our Apple II display, here's the Apple IIe waiting for the Apple II Pi card. And now it is booting directly off the Apple II Pi card, running the standard Apple II Pi client that used to exist on the floppy disk. So this is using a feature of the Apple II Pi called the Pi drives, which has existed for 6 or 7 years. But now, instead of the physical floppy required to boot the client, the Pi card, in conjunction with its boot ROM, is able to provide that functionality right off the bat. So you can boot your Apple II into basically any disk image you want, but for the Apple II Pi client, so that it loads right into Linux. That's how we have it pre-configured with the Apple II Pi SD card image. Now, our Apple II is now talking to the Raspberry Pi card, so let's switch back to its input. It has loaded right into the GS emulator. So this default configuration will boot straight into a Apple II GS environment that is enabled for Ethernet. It can do TCP/IP. This was sort of the default GS image that Speccy provided for a lot of his TCP/IP utilities. We will get into that perhaps a little bit later. Let's continue on. We are going to quit, so we're going to tell our emulator that we're going to shut down. And at this point, it looks like we can just power down our GS emulator. The way to exit out is with Alt F4. You will notice we do not have an F4 key on our Apple IIe. So the Option and Open Apple keys, the Option also maps the closed Apple key on the other Apple IIe keyboards, but on this Platinum it maps to Option. But the Option or closed Apple and Open Apple keys together, pressing the 4 key, basically allows us to do an Alt F4. So we hold those two down, press the 4, and exit out of the emulator. Now our default configuration on the Apple II Pi SD card now launches us directly into the Raspbian or Raspberry Pi OS graphical user interface. This is the standard kind of look you would get with the Raspberry Pi if you were to just pick it up off their website and load it. And so we've kind of tweaked the desktop a little bit to give it sort of an Apple II GS flair perhaps. But because this computer is about the most bare bones Apple IIe you can run, we don't have a mouse, you'll notice. So we'll have to do everything off the keyboard. However, we do have a joystick. So let's do something real quick. Let's bring up our menu. Now we're doing this with the keys to start with, so the closed Apple escape key will bring our drop-down menu up, and then we can navigate with the arrow keys over to our terminal program. Let's bring that up, and in a second we get a terminal program that we can use to load the additional drivers. So we have to be the super user, so we'll do what's called sudo. Now you will have to understand and learn some Linux commands, and that's the whole point of the Apple II Pi environment, is that it is a modern environment for the Apple II, and as such it's a lot more sophisticated than the original Apple II ever was. Even Apple GSOS as a GUI was a lot more sophisticated, and you had to learn all new things for the Apple II. The Apple II Pi is also a big step up in terms of sophistication and capability. So here we will do the sudo command to load A2 Joy MOU, which stands for mouse. This is the Apple II joystick mouse driver. As soon as we load that, lo and behold, my joystick will operate the mouse cursor. So I can use this button on top. It treats it as a mouse button. I can move windows around. I can come over to the drop-down menu. I can navigate just as I could with the mouse, but with the joystick. Now, if you have an Apple II mouse, that will automatically be used as the system mouse. If you want to plug in a USB mouse into the Raspberry Pi, you can do that as well, and that will work as your mouse under the emulator, the GS emulator, and the Raspberry Pi operating system GUI. So you have multiple options on how to interact with your Apple II Pi. So this is just showing the ability to use your existing Apple II peripherals that you may have lying around and be able to use them in a modern environment. We are done with our driver load, but let's explore a little further. We have everything you'd expect under the Raspberry Pi operating system, basically Linux. It's a Debian-based Linux distribution, and it runs really quite nicely on a Raspberry Pi 2 and above. The Raspberry Pi 1 or the Pi 0 are a little constrained, but they're more than adequate to run the emulator. It's just if you want to go and explore the GUI interface, they get a little slow. However, let's go ahead and explore some fun things we can do from Linux to interact directly with our Apple II. One of the fun little tricks, I guess you can call it, is to now drill back down to our Apple II from this Linux terminal window. And there's a program called A2 Term, which through a whole lot of magic now connects us directly to our Apple II AppleSoft environment. So you may not have noticed, but we have a little AppleSoft bracket, and we can actually program in AppleSoft on the Apple II through this terminal window. Let's do that. Let's just do a silly little program that prints to the screen, "Hello, Apple II Pi." This is like the first program everybody would learn when they were in middle school. And we'll just go to 10, have it just loop around forever. Now what we see here is the Apple II running an AppleSoft program, printing to the screen, but also having it show up in our Linux terminal window. Now, believe it or not, I can prove that this is actually running on the Apple II. I will switch back to the Apple II screen. Our Apple II screen is running that program right here in AppleSoft. So that's the output from our Apple II directly. So we can see, I can stop it. We can list our program. This is just like using your Apple II. Here's where the magic continues to happen. We go back and you'll notice here we are in our Apple II terminal window, right where we left off. This is only works for the text-based programs. You know, if you use the graphical modes, they won't show up inside this little window. Of course, they'll show up on your Apple II output, but for this is just a text-based interface. We can actually go into the monitor. We can poke around our Apple II all day long, and as long as we don't exit back to ProDOS, we will have full interactivity with Linux and the Apple II concurrently. So this is multitasking on your little Apple II. Okay, so here we're going to shut down and insert the floppy disk back in here. So we'll come over here, shut down, and as this turns off, we want to wait till our Raspberry Pi shuts all the way down so as to not corrupt any of the SD card images. And as soon as our TV shows no signal, we will connect our floppy disk back to our Apple II. So a little short on space here. We'll take our floppy disk. And what we're going to do, because our floppy disk goes in slot 6, yet we still want to boot from the Apple II Pi card, we're going to move the Apple II Pi card to slot 7. Our Apple II will scan from our slot starting with slot 7, looking for a bootable device. So if we provide a bootable device before the floppy, then we will get that as a boot priority. Now in Apple II GS, you have the ability to go in and adjust which slot you boot from. But with this plain Jane Apple IIe, we don't have that option. We'll screw all that in later. Let's connect our floppy disk to the back connector. All right, here we are rebooting with our floppy disk attached. We'll give it a moment to do its boot sequence. Here's our little Apple II Pi splash screen, if you haven't seen that before. And it automatically logs into the Apple II user account, which will jump us right into the GS port emulator right off the bat. I can show you something really clever. Now, inside our emulator, we can access devices connected to our Apple II. So if we bring up our emulator disk configuration, we're going to map our physical floppy drive, which shows up here. Now, the emulator wants to scan each device. It thinks it's a file, but in reality, it's scanning the physical floppy. So it's going to take a couple seconds here for it to read the entire floppy image. This floppy disk image is a file transfer utility I wrote under Plasma using the Ethernet card. But for this purpose, we're just going to use it to read and write, or just read the files and the directory structure that exists on it, just to kind of show that we can, basically. So the reason why this takes a bit of time is floppy disks are much, much slower than our SD cards used in the Raspberry Pi, and it has to transfer all the data over to the Raspberry Pi. But now we are mapping our physical floppy, which the emulator believes is just a file under Linux. So let's go back to our main config. We'll exit back to our emulator. And now over here, we can go to our floppy disk. And we will open that up. And now we see that we have mapped, it's called the TFTPD floppy, and that's the one that is in our floppy. We'll open that up. And now we see all the files that exist on our physical floppy inside the emulator, mounted as a floppy disk. So that's how you can move files around, you do all kinds of crazy stuff inside the emulator with your physical Apple II devices, storage devices. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and quit though, because we're done with that. Our emulator is going to put everything away. And we're going to exit our emulator. Now we return to the Raspberry Pi operating system, and it launches us now into the GUI, the graphical user interface that comes with the Raspberry Pi. And we've tweaked it a little bit to mimic the Apple IIgs color set a little bit. Now you'll notice that one of the things the Raspberry Pi operating system does is it scans all of our devices, all of our storage, including our floppy, which shows up as a mounted file system under Linux. Now again, I don't have a mouse connected, so I'm going to reload my my joystick mouse driver. So give me a second. We will, at some point, make that a boot time driver load option, and that will be a later video on how you do that. Let's load our driver. So that we have our joystick mouse. Now we can come over here and explore our physical floppy as it shows up under Linux. And that was a TFTPD floppy. We'll come over here and open that up. You can see it's accessing our floppy. Remember, floppies are slow. here we now find the files from our floppy existing under the Linux file manager. Just to prove, we can go back to our Apple II with the A2 term, and we can do a catalog of the TFTPD disk. This is what the Apple II sees. This is what Linux sees. All from the physical Apple II floppy under both environments. So, showing that this isn't just a little quick parlor trick, this is in fact a real file system and interaction between the Apple II and your Raspberry Pi. Hope that clarifies a few things, and it probably led to a lot more questions as well. But thanks for watching, and come to the Facebook Apple II Pi Enthusiast page to get more of your questions answered or talk about other features that exist under the Apple II Pi system. Thanks again for watching.